So, today I have two projects planned. Project number uno is this one. Why is it not showing? It's fine. All right then. All right. So this is what we want to do today. I will guide you through the steps.
Very abstract.
But if it doesn't look like this on your screen, then I'll tell you. So really pay attention. I always forget which one it is. This one. Yes! TVs are way too complex for me.
Is this it?
This is it? Oh, very good. Okay, so this is the first thing that we want to build. And what we will learn specifically is how we can integrate something with a picture. So everything we see in the background is a photo, and the text is then added with Cinema 4D. And with Cinema 4D, we also do all the integration that we see here on the floor. This example will be a little bit simpler and more abstract, whereas the second example is a little bit more concrete, which is this one here. And with this one, we will actually use the real surrounding to set up the light, and we will use also the real surrounding to figure out what kind of camera it is. So what is the focal length, where is geometry, and stuff like this.
Is that all built or is that just an image?
It's just an image, and only the text is added to it. But you will see very quickly how the background is then used in Cinema 4D. It is quite interesting, but we will see it when we get there. So the first example is this one here. I will do the first steps first, as always. Afterwards, we will do them together. I will start by actually modeling this. I will do the modeling, then I will do the integration with the background, and then we will do the texture. So I start, or maybe you can already guess what I need to do. So if I want to write some text, what is probably the first thing that I do? A mo text, exactly. So I go to mo graph and I choose mo text. And the text that I've written was cozy. I've used a bold font and I aligned it to the middle. But I can see that the letters are further apart than I want them to be. And each letter needs to be moved a little bit differently to get these overlaps. How do I do that?
What?
What?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, but the horizontal spacing is applied to all the letters, but what if I want to move them individually? It's the kerning, where I enable the Show 3D GUI. When I do that, I can select every single character, and I can move it more to the center. Like this. And this way, I can create the coziness of the text. All right. Next, we can see that everything apparently seems to be one element, but right now I have some not so nice overlaps. I don't see it because they overlap perfectly, but they are overlaps that can make me run into issues later. And I can see that everything is quite rounded. Exactly. So, to get this look, I use the volume builder again. I drop the mo text inside. I then need to decrease the voxel size. I think a size of 1 should be good enough for us. Then I smooth everything out a little bit, and I drop it into a volume measure. So far, so good. Maybe I round everything a little bit further, so I go to the smooth layer, and maybe I use a voxel distance of 3 and iterations of 2 to get this really very, very rounded and smooth shape. I also want this to be a little bit thicker, so I go to the mo text and I increase the depth to 40 or 50 or something. Notice that I only used uppercase letters. Remember, when we use lower cases like P or G, they would go into the floor and then things don't really work out the way that we would expect them to. So when we have 3D text that should lie on something, I generally recommend using only uppercase letters. Unless, of course, you have a word where it works, like done. That could work. Alrighty, how do I then create this random displacement?
Putting a texture in and then doing this.
I don't want to use the texture because I don't really see a live feedback of how it displaces, so I would like to use the other option. So where do I find the displacement thing? No. That's not the thing that I'm looking for.
Yeah,
It wasn't true.
It's purple.
Line.
How is this purple? It's not purple.
Bend.
Yeah, it's underneath the bend. So underneath the bend, we find all the purple deformers. And we also have the... I'm blind, where is it? Yep. Why don't I see it? There we go. The displacer, and that's the one that I want to use. Where do I have to put it so that it's applied to my text? Exactly. So we know that a deformer is always applied to its parent. So I don't want to place it into the mode text because the mode text hardly has any geometry that I could displace. So I want to apply it to the thing that is already my final geometry. So I apply it here into the volume measure. Then I can go to the displacer, to the shading. Then in the shader, I click on the play button and I go to noise. And I can see that this is now displacing my text. To style this, I can open up the options of the noise. I can take a look at some different noise previews by clicking on this super tiny arrow down here. And I get some rough previews of how the noises will look like. And I think this one, the electric one, might work fine in this scenario. Like, this looks good, but this not so much. So I guess I want this, if I look here, I can see it's way more undefined. And here's way too much detail. So what is the thing that I need to change for this? Well, octaves would be one thing. Did we ever do that?
Noise,
Huh?
level of detail, space.
It is the scale.
You read all of them.
Animation speed.
We're done. We already have the answer. It's the global scale. That's what you said, right? So do I increase this or decrease this?
Decrease. No increase.
If I if I decrease this, it gets smaller, and then I add more details. I mean, this is also interesting, but not really what I'm looking for.
Increase it. That's what we all said all the time.
So now I can increase it, and I can see how much larger values are now nicely and in an interesting way, displace my texture.
What are you basically doing to the displacement? It's making it so large so that
It just changes the size of the noise. So essentially, it creates this sort of fog. So if I have, if I just look at my noise in here, as a texture, and I apply this to my plane, and I enable noises to be previewed correctly like this, you can see that this is pretty small, but if I increase the scale, it just makes it larger. And it uses this noise to displace our object. White goes outside and black goes towards the inside. So that's pretty much how it works. And this is how we create some interesting displacement on the text here. Alrighty, Let's get to this point here together. We start by creating a text. For this, we go to MoGraph and we choose the Mo text. This one, as I said, preferably should be uppercase. You can write something else, of course. Don't waste too much time on the font. It will be quite displaced later on anyways. I recommend using a bold font, and don't forget to change the align from left to middle. It will just be a little bit easier later on. So we should now have a bold text that is centered in the world. So far, so good? All right. Next, we want to grab every single letter and move it closer to the next one. For this, we need to enable the Show 3D GUI. Then you can click on the character that is shown above the actual character, and then you can click and drag it to the side to move it closer to the previous letter. That was the water. So far, so good? Yeah. Good. Then we want this to be merged and rounded, and for this we will use the volume builder. We drop the Mo text into the volume builder. Then we should see that we get this pixel preview of all the voxels that it's generating. In order to get more detail into this, we need to decrease the voxel size and therefore increasing the amount of voxels. We select the volume builder and we go to the voxel size and we change it to 1. We should now have a way more accurate representation of our model. It might need to think for a little bit because it's now a lot more voxels that it needs to calculate. So far, so good? This element we then want to be smoothed. So in the volume builder, we add a smooth layer. We add a smooth layer. Then we change the settings of the smooth layer by selecting it in the list here. Then we go to the voxel distance. We change it to 3 and the iterations to 2. We should now have a very rounded representation of our text. So far, so good? I now want this to be a little bit thicker. So let's go to the Mo text and increase the depth. I will change it to 40. After some thinking, it should then update the volume builder. All right. Next, we will go to the instance and we choose the volume mesher. We then drop the volume builder into the volume mesher and we should get a nice, smooth polygon representation of what we just built. We good? Yes. Next, we want this to be displaced. So we go into our deformers and we choose the displacer. Now the placement of the displacer is very important. Oops. What am I doing?
Nice.
Wait. What is the... No. This one. We back? Good. I hit the wrong key. The displacer needs to be inside of the volume mesher. So the displacer we drag into the volume mesher. We don't see anything happening just yet because the displacer doesn't have any information of how it should displace. So with the displacer selected, we will go to the shading, and we click on the play button next to shader. There, we will then choose noise. And now we should see how our text is being displaced, like so. So far, so good?
Yes.
Then we can style this a little bit further. So we go into our noise settings.
Just press on noise.
Just press on noise. Either the preview or the name. Then we change the type of noise. And what I sometimes like to do is, instead of just clicking randomly on names, because I can never remember what they look like, you can click on this arrow next to the noise drop down, and then you can see a preview of the different noise types. And I think I will go again for the electric one. Then we will take the global scale and we increase this value until we feel like we have a nice even displacement, so around 400 or 500. So far, so good? One more thing that I want to add to this is how much it displaces. I do like sort of the scale of it, but I don't like that it displaces so much. So I think there are two large differences between the thin parts and the thick parts. I want this to be a little bit more even. For this, we don't do this in the noise. Instead, we have to do it in the displacer. So we go up one level up here with the arrow. Then we are back in the displacer. We can then click on the object, and here we can see how much the displacer should displace. So when we increase this value, this displacement gets stronger, but we want the opposite of this. So we rather want it to be only displaced a little bit, like 3 or 4 centimeters, just so that we can feel this. We can see the structure of the noise, we can see a little bit of randomness in the thickness. Alrighty. So far, so good? Mm-hmm. Awesome. Then this would be a good point to just save the file. And the next steps I will do first. Afterwards, we do them together. I now want this to be inside of the picture that I've taken. And for this, I need to load this in somehow. So how could I add the picture? What could I use? I could create a floor, because it obviously needs to sit on something. So I take the floor and I create a new material. I turn off the reflectance and I want to focus only on the color. I click on the ... and I will open up the folder that you've gotten, which is in this one here. And I load the regular image. I click on open. I don't want to copy this, I want to keep it where it is. I also want this to be viewed as sharp as possible, because when I apply it here, if I zoom in, I will notice that this is very, very blurry and it's kind of hard to see where the sharp area is supposed to be. How can I make it view a little bit sharper in the preview? I hear too much typing and too little answering to my question. We've done this a couple of times already in the past. If I want this to not be scaled down, but I want to see the original quality of the image.
Not scale.
This is not the mirror one, right?
Sorry for?
No, no,
Yeah, is it no scale? Yeah, it's
no. Yeah, it's no scaling, but where is that option?
texture. Is it in
No,
I suppose.
no. It's in the editor.
Yeah.
In the editor,
Yeah, texture.
texture preview size, and there I choose no scaling. And now I can zoom in here and I can see the original quality of the image and I can clearly see where the focus of the camera is. Alrighty. Next, I want this to always match to my camera. So what would I do? Right now it's just applied in tiles, but I want it to be sort of like projected onto the floor based on my view.
Changing the projection.
Mm-hmm. Where do I do that?
You go into the material
Mm-hmm.
and projection.
Mm.
Flat to
To frontal, exactly. So now the image will always be projected from the camera view. Of course, don't be irritated. As I change the angle here, it will be darker or brighter. But this doesn't matter, we will fix that later on. So for now, just adjust it until you feel like the sharp areas here. If we get too irritated, especially on the Mac, sometimes the dark can be really, really dark. What we can do is we can go to display and we could choose the constant shading. And this way we lose details on our text here, of course, we can't really see it that much, but we can see the background always, no matter what angle we have. So with this, we can find a nice angle where the text sits in the correct spot where it's supposed to be. Next, I want to fill my background. So what do I add? I already.
What do you want to film?
I want a background object, exactly.
Okay, so put that.
I go to the floor and I choose a background here. And I apply the same material to the background. And now I can see how these things are now lining up quite nicely, and I can easily adjust my camera to where it's supposed to be. Now later on, when I create my shader and add some hair to it, I might want to move around my camera, but then it will be quite hard after I zoomed in to then always have to go back and try to find the correct spot again. So once I found a spot that I like, what do I do if I want to kind of save this position? I add a camera, exactly. Then, to make sure that I don't accidentally move the camera, I lock it. For locking, I right-click on it, go to Cinema 4D tags, and I will choose the protection. This means that position, scale, and rotation are protected. I can't move this around anymore, or at least not while I'm in it. So when I'm in it, everything is locked, but when I'm outside of the camera, I can still move around, but I can always go back into the camera and I'm precisely where I was before. Alrighty. Now when I render this, it looks like this. So what am I missing?
Lights.
I am missing some lights. So, I will want to use two things to light up my scene. What is probably the first thing that I will add? A sky. I usually start with a sky, just to have some ambient general lighting. So I click on the floor, I choose the light, the sky. Now, however, I have the issue that I see the sky in the background. I can render, and I can see that something is happening, but the sky is replacing my background. So what do I do? I right-click on the sky, go to Cinema 4D tags, and I choose the compositing tag. In the compositing tag, I can then tell the sky to not be seen by the camera. Alright, so far so good, almost there. I render this, and I realize, the color is not perfect. I can see how these things are not seamless. We've done this at the very beginning of our last quarter, where we used So what do we do if we want to blend this? What is the function?
We have to apply same color something both of them.
Well, they already have the same color.
Yeah.
But the bottom one, no, that's not it. We used it when we wanted a constant color. for the floor, so that the floor perfectly integrates with the sky or a background.
Yeah, I remember the class.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The guy with
one of the
red.
last classes. 2 years
No,
ago.
it was for that other text thing, right? The movie.
No, the guy with the
Yeah.
Nah.
Almost.
Let me give you a hint. Alright, so the hint is we just used that exact tag that we need.
Composite.
So it's the compositing tag. Let me get there. So where would I apply the compositing tag to? Probably the floor, exactly, because the floor needs to change. So I right click on the floor, Cinema 4D tags, and I choose the compositing tag. And now, what is the option that I need to enable or disable?
compositing background.
Compositing background, exactly. I need to tell this one that it's a compositing background. This means it will look like there are no lights on it. It will be a constant color, except on all the places where shadows would be cast. So when I now render, I only get the shadows, and the rest is perfectly seamless with the background. Genius. It is. All right. Next. One thing, we have not done this in the past, but maybe you can think of this on your own. I don't think...
Barely anything.
I don't think that the colors here are correct. Because the surrounding, of course, I don't really know what colors it should be, but here everything is kind of greenish.
That's because you're using a Windows.
No. Everything here is kind of greenish, but when I look at my text, it only gets a perfectly gray color. It doesn't really feel like it's getting the colors that I see from the surrounding. So it feels a little bit like it's put on top. It's not that well integrated. So what could I do in order to adjust the light in a way that it fits to the light that I see here?
Could you add lights that has the color of the background?
That would be one thing.
Or you could make it a little bit of,
But I want it to be simpler. That feels like too much work.
Like, we can't do something with the luminance with the material.
Ah, yes we can. Although I'm not quite sure which material you mean.
Lower on the background.
No, I don't think that's it.
Global
The text.
illumination.
Yeah, and the global illumination happens right now because of the sky. Exactly. So the sky is the one that has a neutral colored light because it's gray. And that's why we have a gray object that gets gray light, and then we have a gray thing.
background to the sky.
We add a color to the sky.
Only a color, not the background.
Oh, you meant the background that we use?
Yeah.
Exactly. That is the thing. I take the exact same material, however, just to be coherent with the previous classes, I will actually duplicate it. I disable the color, I enable the luminance. Here, a little trick. I can click on the texture play button and I can choose a bitmap. And then I can choose a bitmap that I've already used in the past. So now I have a material with that same image applied. I can apply this to the sky, and now that image will be used to illuminate this, and I can see that now this gets these different colors. I can see from the top it gets a little bit more of a bluish color, because this will be at the top of the sky, whereas the bottom areas are a lot darker and more greenish. So when we don't really know what the surrounding is, we can just take the image that we use for the background and we apply it to the sky to just at least have roughly the correct colors. Now I said I will need two things to light this up. The reason is that just the sky is not doing it for me. I think the shadows here are a little bit too soft, and when I look at the parts here in the background, I can see that there's a clear light coming from the top and the back. So what do I add? You said it before. An area light, exactly. So I go to my lights here and I choose the area light.
Not a target light,
No, a target light by default is a spotlight, and I don't like that. Also, an area light is probably more likely.
Target lights help you make your shadows more prominent, right? Or we can do that with an area light.
We can do that with an area light too. The thing about a target light is it's always a spotlight by default that already has a target tag applied to it.
Yeah, which will be the word, right? Which will be the text.
Which will be the text, exactly. And we sort of rebuild that, but with an area light. So with the area light, we would make it to a target light by right-clicking on it, going to Cinema 4D tags, and choose target. And then we just choose our volume measure as the target. So now I can go outside of my camera, then we maybe go to the side here, and I can take the light, and I can move it backwards. And it will always point towards my text. So I want this to be a little bit further back, something like this, and I also want this to be a lot larger because I want the shadow to be very, very soft. But do I get a shadow? Does he always give answers like this? So we need to add the shadow to the light because right now we don't see it. So I go to type, not to type, underneath it, to shadow, and I change the shadow type from none to area. Will I get a shadow now?
No.
Yes, I do get a shadow now. I just don't see the shadow in the preview here. If I render, I will see that I do get a shadow. We can see we have a clear shadow here. I just don't see the preview. The reason for that is that it needs to be enabled. It is not display, it is options, and there we have the shadows option. So when a light is enabled to cast shadows, it will cast shadows. It's a little bit like the motion blur in After Effects. When we enable it for the layer, it will be in the final rendering. But if we want to see it already in the editor, we have to hit this special button. And here it's the same for the shadows. But wait, I just enabled this option. So my light is casting a shadow, and my options have shadows clearly enabled. I still don't see it. What could be the issue?
Display.
Exactly, the display. Because earlier we changed the display to constant shading, which means there's light coming from everywhere. It ignores the default lights that we have. So here I would switch back to the growth shading, and now I can see a better preview here. And it's a little bit easier for me to understand how the shadows will fall later on. Now, I, however, feel the shadow is a little bit too grayish. So kind of the same issue that we had before. And this is a little bit of an issue with the compositing background tag, because it doesn't really get GI the way that it would really work, because it really wants to show this color correctly, so it doesn't really mix the GI as it usually would. So the shadow is really just one color. So if I want to integrate the shadow with the background a little bit better, I need to tint it. To do that, I will go to the light, to the shadow options, and here I can actually pick a color. And as a color, I will pick a dark area here so that the shadow already has kind of the correct color. This color looks like it would be very, very bright, but in reality it won't be that bright. But when I render, I will see that the shadow now looks a lot more integrated because it has a less grayish color and a color that is more suitable for the floor that it's on. Alrighty, let's do this together. And yes. We want to start by adding a floor. So we go to our floor object. Then we want to apply our material to the floor. We double click in an empty area in the material panel. We double click on the material. In this case, we don't want it to have reflectance at all, so we turn this option off. We go to the color option and we click on the ... next to texture. And we will choose from the folder 01 General the image with the weird name, but not the close-up, the other one. It ends in 21. Then we hit open and we say, no, we don't want it to be copied. It should stay where it is. Now we already know that we want this to be shown in the original quality, not scaled down. So where was that option?
Editor.
In the editor, then the texture preview size should be changed from default to no scaling. Now this material we can apply to our floor. So far so good?
Yes.
Next, we want this to be projected always based on our camera view. So we select the tag. Then we change the projection from flat, frontal. So now we should see, no matter how we move the camera, it always feels like we're cutting out the image. Now I do think it's a little bit irritating so that it gets so dark. So let's change our display from growth shading to constant shading. Now it should be quite simple to move our text so that it's nicely centered and in the area where the camera is focused. So far so good?
It has to be black.
Oh, you used the constant shading with lines.
Yeah. Oh.
And that's why you see all the lines from the volume measure. And that's irritating. So just choose the constant shading and then it should look fine. Alrighty. Next, we want a background. So we click and hold on the floor and we choose a background. Here we will apply the same material to the background. And it should be a seamless transition from the floor to the background. Next, we want to add a little bit of light, and we usually start with the sky.
Leonard, why does yours have the
Because of the ratio that my viewer has, if I have a viewer like this, then I will have it at the bottom and maybe also at the top. And like this, I will have it on the sides. Because the image is always applied based on the camera, but if the camera ends, it just repeats it outside of it.
What? It has changed.
On the material of the floor,
Yes.
change it from flat to frontal.
Oh, sorry.
There we go.
Thank you.
Alrighty. Next, we want to add some light, so we go to the sky. We already know that the sky should use the same material. But when we use materials on the sky, we should place the color in the luminance. So let's duplicate the material that we already have. Open it up. Disable the color. Enable the luminance. Next to texture, we click on the play button. We go to bitmaps and we choose the image that we used previously. And this luminance material is then applied to the sky. And when we render, it should look like this. Are you sure? Because it can look like this. Is it like this? Yeah? Alright. So now we have the issue that we see the sky and not the actual background. So depending on your camera angle, this might be more or less. So if I look from further up, I would not see the background. But the more I look from down below, I will see at the horizon line starting with the sky and not the background. So the sky should not be visible by the camera. To do that, we right click on the sky, go to Cinema 4D tags, and we choose the compositing tag. On the compositing tag, we disable the scene by camera option. Now when we render, we should have the same image neatly aligned with the floor. Lastly, we need to tell the floor that it is a compositing background so that it fits seamlessly together with the background. We right-click on the floor, go to Cinema 4D tags, and we choose the compositing tag. And we enable the compositing background option. When we now render, we should have a perfectly seamlessly connection between the floor and the background, and we should get something that looks like this. We good? Awesome. Next, we want to add some additional light that comes from the back, so we get some nice highlights around the edges from our text. And additionally, we want to have a more intense shadow. For this, we will create an area light. We click and hold, we choose the area light. We want the area light to always look at our volume measure. So we right-click on the light, we choose Cinema 4D tags, and we choose the target tag. And we drag the volume measure inside the target object. You could also use the text. In the end, it will end up being the same thing. When we then move our camera around, we should see if we move the light, it will always look at our text. And we want the light to come from behind and a little bit above. So something like this. Alrighty. Now the light, I want to be a little bit larger, so I make it a lot wider and a little bit higher. Something like this. So I want the shadow to be really, really soft. So far, so good. Then the light needs to cast a shadow. So we select it. We go to the General tab. And we change the shadow from none to area. We also know that the shadow needs to be tinted. So we go to the shadow option. And we use the color picker to pick a dark green color from the corner. Alrighty. Next, we want to be able to see already a little bit of a preview in here of the floor. So we will go to Options, and we enable the shadows. And we don't see it because our display is not correct. So we change the display to garage shading. And now it should look something like this. So Options, enable the shadows, and Display, enable garage shading. And then it should look like this. So now let's figure out what probably the correct angle and placement of the camera is. And when we are happy with this, we can do a quick render to see what it looks like. So something like this. And then we want to save this angle of the camera. So we we add a new camera, then we right-click on the camera, we go to Cinema 4D tags, and we choose the protection. Then we also want to go into the camera, and then we are locked into this view. If you ever want to change this view, if you just want to move around, go outside of the camera, and then you can move around freely, but you can always go back into the camera. If you want to move the camera, you need to delete the protection tag, then you can adjust the camera, and then you can add the protection tag again. Okay?
Can you show me how to put the protection as
Cinema 4D tags, and then protection. And that's it. Alrighty. Next.
Did you do something with protection tags?
No, it's just applied and then it's done. Alrighty. Next, we want to add a little bit of an interesting texture here. I already have the texture applied, but I still want to create it together with you. So when we apply it, we will use the texture that I have prepared, but you will now tell me how I prepared that texture. So I will show you the finished product. I will show you the finished product. So we have it in here. Jip, jip, jip. I want to have this thing and this thing.
You have made it on Photoshop.
I have made it on Photoshop, and I started with a picture of this from the top. So this is what I will open up in Photoshop, and you tell me how I get from this to this. So, I open this up in Photoshop, and what is probably the first thing that I do?
Cat separate them.
Put it in words. Not scale.
Merge them.
color change? Replace
No, he was doing this. Cropping. Cropping. I want to crop this because we know it's always easier to make something tileable if it's square, and Cinema by default applies everything in a square format anyways. So, I will open up the crop tool, but I should use the correct one, and I will choose a ratio of 1:1. Then, I think I can safely delete the crop pixels, and I hit enter. Okay, but this should be kind of a similar color than the bottom. So when I look at the original image, I have it over here, over here, this color is completely different than this one. This is a lot greener, and this is not the color at all. Also, I have a weird gradient on here. In the top, it's more yellowish, in the bottom, it's more bluish. So if this tiles, then it will look really ugly. So if I just do this really quickly, I could move this down, duplicate it, move it up, and I can see that these things are not matching together at all. So how do I get rid of these colors?
Lighting filter.
We've done this last quarter with a bark texture, and also with a texture that is very similar to this one actually. But you should have watched the recording, so that's not an excuse. We used an effect that is also used for sharpening or smoothing skin. Let me give you a hint. No.
Gaussian.
No. How would you sharpen something with a Gaussian blur? Sharpen blur.
Stylize.
No. Let me give you another hint. High pass. Exactly. Do you remember what the high pass does? Let me show you. First, I convert this into a smart object. Then I go to filter, other, and I choose high pass. And high pass gives me sort of this sharp and flat version of this. The smaller the radius is, the smaller the details are that I'm getting. So the smaller this value is, the less of the general shape I get and just get small details. If I use a very, very large value, then I can see a lot more of the larger shapes and shadows. I don't want this, I want something in between. I want it to be very, here you can see if I make it very large, I again see the yellowish and the bluish here. I don't want this to happen. So I want something in between where I can see lots of the textures, a little bit of the small irregularities, but not too much. So I think a value of 80, I think should be fine for this. Now this is even grayer than the thing was before. So what could I use to have this brightness information, but on a color that matches kind of like this color? Oh boy! I just need to figure out what color this is, and I will use this as a background color, and then I will use overlay and or hard light.
Is that easy? You don't have to say that.
And that is so obvious, I don't want to say.
Yeah.
Really, it was. It's like, why are you asking? That's the most obvious thing.
Uh-huh.
Super obvious.
Okay. So, fun question. How do I figure out what the average color of this is?
Color picker.
Use the symbol,
Hmm?
the thing.
Ah, I have to use the thing. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I think that we discussed about that.
Hmm?
I
We
drop
discussed
her
about
too.
that day.
I drop her too.
Well, I could use the eyedropper. However, if I use this, what do I do? I mean, I could just click somewhere, but wherever I click, you can see the color is always changing here. It's never the same color. So this is a very bad thing to pick an average color. I could, however, use the color picker to get more of an average. And how do I do that? We have not done this. But if you already suggest the color picker, tell me how I should use it properly.
First use it, then use it.
Well, I used it and I showed you that this is not good enough, but I tell you that we can change something that makes it better. Okay, if you now think, there are only 3 options that the color picker has. 1,
3D.
2, 3 options.
Show sampling.
Fine sample, so it's not that simple.
All layers.
So
Instead of all layers, you go average.
on the point sample, I can define how large the picker is. If it should pick a single color where I click on with the cursor, or if it should take an average of 3 by 3, 5 by 5, and so on.
So what do we have to choose?
So, this would be one option. However, even if I use 100 by 100, this might still be a little bit too small, and I'm not quite sure how large the average is that it takes. Even if it's just this area here, it's just this area, but I want an average of this super large area. So, a picker could work in certain scenarios, but it's still kind of hard to control what the actual area is where I take the average color from. So I will do what we've done last quarter, and I use an effect, or a filter it's called. First, I crop this. I use the marquee selection to select the part where I want to figure out the average color. I hit C for the crop tool and I hit enter twice. Then I will go to filter, blur, and average. And then I have the average color of this. Then I can use the color picker even at a point sample and take this color. Now I want to use this as my background color, so I go to solid color, use my foreground, drop it at the bottom, and I change this layer to overlay, and now I can see how I have this texture on the correct color. So now we went from, just to show you, this is what we started with, and this is what we have now. So we are already a lot closer to what we want to have. I personally think that overlay usually is not strong enough, I think the highlights are not high enough and the shadows are not dark enough. So what I usually do is I duplicate the layer and I use a hard light on this one, but way less of an intensity. Just like 10–20%, just to add a little bit more of a contrast in the details. It doesn't change the overall look much, but when we get closer, it's just a little bit more defined. Alrighty, so the colors are correct. Our texture has less gradation on it, but will this tile? The answer is no. Will this tile, or more like, will this tile seamlessly? How do I check if this tiles well?
With the edges, like to see if there's consistent.
But how do I get to that thing where I see the edges?
Need to go to edit and fill, cut them, and
Export this and then put it onto the c4d and then check. Okay.
Oh boy, maybe I have to give you more homework. Maybe you remember things better.
yeah, please.
Well, these are not techniques that you usually do in Photoshop unless you do 3D. So, you should still remember these things. Okay. Here, what I want to do is create a merged copy of everything that I see. So I use Command-Alt-Shift-E as a shortcut to create a layer that is just a copy of everything merged underneath it. Then I will use an effect that offsets my image. I need to know by how much I want to offset it. So I open up, I open up the image size and I can see it's 3,400 pixels wide. So I want this to be offset by half, which is kind of like, 1,700 something. We don't have to do it. We don't have to do it exactly. So we will go to Filter, Other, and we use the offset. And here, you set it 1,746 is the exact value, and I do that on both axes. So now, when I hit OK, I can see how this would tile, and I can see it tiles kind of okay, but not too much. There's still some clear edges that I can see. So how do I get rid of these edges that I can still see? The what? But what if I'm too lazy and I want to use a more automated way and see if that might already work better?
That's true.
Yeah, and is there a more...
Spot cleaning thingy.
It's that technique, but what is it called, what they use?
The spot removal.
Yeah, but what is it what that uses? What is behind it? What happens? It does a...
Clean.
It does a constant aware fill.
Content aware.
Oh man! Okay. So in order to do the constant aware fill, I will create a mask around this. And the mask
yeah, I can explain myself.
Sure.
looks something like this. Is there a specific reason why I made the shape like this? Did I just do it so that it looks pretty?
You like crosses. No,
Or-
it's for the tile.
Yeah, Christian.
It is for the tile. The reason is, if I would go to this entire edge, it does a constant aware fill here. But I already know that this and this fit seamlessly. But when I do a constant aware fill here and there, the program doesn't know that they should match together. So here it will do a different fill than on the right side. So if I do it like this, I will still get weird seams. So this shape here gives us the best option to have most of our annoying parts removed without messing with the already continuous working elements here. So to open up...
Is there a thing that how wide it needs to be or how narrow it needs to be?
No, You can see I did it quite randomly here. It just needs to be a pointy cross, and that works in most scenarios. Then, to use the constant-aware fill, I can either go to Edit and then Fill. I can use the shortcut that Photoshop provides officially, which is Shift F5, or what works even better is the unofficial shortcut Shift and Delete. And here, I would choose not a color, which is the default. Instead, I will use the constant-aware function to fill this. I then hit OK, and I can see how all of my seams are now gone. Yeah, we can still see that in some areas it used some wrong rotations, and it's not perfect, for sure. But A, we are never this close to the texture, and B, from afar, this looks a lot better than, I don't have the comparison. Let me copy this. Than this. So here we can see very clear, sharp edges, and here we don't see them. And this is exactly. If the constant-aware fill does not give us results that are good enough, then of course we have to start using either the patch tool manually or the clone stamp tool. But in this scenario, because we will never be that close to the texture, we just look for something that from afar gives us an even, seamless look. Alrighty. Now, one thing that is new to us, and this is, I think this is new, how I created this texture here. Or have you seen something like this before? You can say no. You can also say yes. Either way, I will show it to you. So, do you know how this is called? If you've seen this before. Let me give you a hint.
Add to normal pane.
It is a normal map. So a normal map is a lot like a bump. So we've used the bump before, right? Where we just use the black and white information of an image to tell cinema something goes out or something goes inwards. However, if we create the bump ourselves, this is a very cheap way to go because it really just works with the brightness information that we have, but there's no smartness behind it. So the bump just suggests everything bright goes up, everything dark goes down. But in reality, that's not it, because usually things have a shading, and usually things go up, so it's in the in-between parts. Like when the light comes from above, and we have sort of a half of a sphere, then sort of the grayish colors would mean something has to go upwards. Kind of understood? Not so important. So the smart way of creating something like this is by going to Filter, 3D, and then generate a normal map. So this one will look at the image. It will try to understand what it sees, and it will try to convert this into information that makes more sense. That is a more realistic representation of what we see here. Usually I do that after I convert this to a smart object. Then I can go to Filter, 3D, and I use the Generate Normal Map. Usually, this default displacement that we get is fine to do. It takes a little bit because the 3D stuff in Photoshop is not too great. So here you can now see how this is applied, a little bit weirdly, but should be fine. Here I usually change the preset to a cube. So I can see my texture here. Then I could also zoom in a little bit, but the zoom is really bad. Here I could then also play around with these values here. Here we can see a little bit of the patching did not work out too great. But I can add less details here or more details there. So with these sliders, we can style this texture to fit our needs and the look that we want to go for. But usually the default values here are kind of fine. Also, I don't like changing them too much because Photoshop is kind of slow with this. Then I hit OK, and I get my normal map out of this. All right. So let's see how we could apply this. And you tell me what I should do. So I have my color and I have my normal map, and I want these nicely applied to my volume measure. So what do? I create a new material. Then
Texture.
Couldn't you have
mhm,
just like, oh, yeah.
I go to my color, and as a texture, I will add the color. And where do you think I would add the normal map? Mm,
Wow.
Normal.
I think a bump I would add to the bump, and a normal I should probably add to the normal. It doesn't work vice versa, because they are very different images or very different informations that the program gets. If you put a bump into a normal, it will look like shit. This is not going to work. And if you place a normal into a bump, it will also result in weird things, and you can hardly see anything. So a bump expects black and white information. A normal expects this purple thing. So I enable the normal map.
So you could have done it also just adding color and create black and white bump and add that and it would have given someone the same.
It would give a similar effect. However, a normal map will always look better than a bump.
Okay.
So already in here, I can see if I do a before and after, this is what it looked like without the normal map, and this is what it looks like with it. So I can see that we feel the texture a lot better and how the light nicely goes around the shape of this. In my editor, I want to get a good look at how the texture looks like, so I go to the editor and I go to the preview size and I choose no scaling. Then I apply this obviously to the volume measure. Let me switch, or let me go outside of the camera and see what this looks like from where I can see stuff a bit better.
Projection.
I guess so. And which projection do I use? Whenever we have something that is too complex and we don't know what shape it is, it's not a sphere, it's not a tube, it's nothing that we see in the list here, you just do cubic. And I can see that right away this is applied a lot nicer and way more evenly without any weird distortions. Alrighty. I think the size already is kind of okay. Maybe I want this to be a little bit larger. What is the easiest way of making this larger? Yeah, but there I have to always change two values, and I want this to remain the correct ratio. I want to scale it up, but what do I scale it up? I don't see anything that I can scale up right now. I switch to the texture mode, and then I can scale up the texture. Too easy, too, right? Alrighty. I can now go back to my camera, I can render this, and I can see how we already have something that kind of fits. Maybe it is still a little bit too dark. I do like the difference of the highlight that I get here, so that works kind of well, but I think this is a little bit too dark. It could be a bit brighter. So what do I do if I want this area here to be less dark? I mean, we have only two things that generate light. We have the light itself, and we have a sky. Which of the two is responsible for the dark areas here?
Position, maybe we can change.
Lights don't generate shadows. Lights generate light. And the shadow is just an absence of light. So this here is not the fault of our light. It's the sky. So if I turn off the sky altogether, like this, and I render it, I will see that it will be pretty black. There's almost no light hitting it, just because of the reflection of the light from the floor going back onto it. So it's the sky that fills up our shadow areas. If I want to make the sky brighter, what do I do? Intensity. And where? In the material. And where?
It's just luminous.
We don't have an option here. We have sort of a mixed strength, but this only goes to 100. We have a brightness, but this is the color that sits underneath the texture, so this is not helping either. So here, I don't have an option to make this brighter. Where's the option to make this brighter? We've also done this in the past. Maybe I should do quizzes. You would fail so hard. Well,
Glow.
illumination, exactly. And in the illumination, it is defined how the GI is generated, and we can increase the strength. Oh. So I go to my strength, and I set it to 150. I'm not quite sure if we will see it in this example too well, so let me just overdo it. Let me go to 400. The sky here doesn't look different, but it will create a lot more light. If I render this, however, it not only intensifies the light, it also intensifies the color. As we can see, this gets suddenly super saturated. So this is where we need to be a little bit more careful with. When we increase the intensity of a sky, we also have to decrease the saturation. Otherwise, we get some weird colors. So, as I increase my strength here to 150, I reduce it a bit, and I decided a value of 50 was doing okay. When I now render this, it will be a bit brighter, so it's a bit nicer to look at, and it feels a bit more integrated with the surrounding. Okay, let's do this together. Let me quickly revert this. And we get rid of the material. We start by creating a new material. Then we go into the color, to the texture, and we click on the dot dot dot. And we choose our fabric pattern color for our color. Then we want to add the normal. We enable the normal channel. We then click on the dot 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 for the texture, and we choose the fabric pattern normal. Then we apply this to our volume measure. In order to see a little bit better what we are doing, let's go outside of the camera and then move around until we see the back side of our text. It should look stretched and unsharp like this. So far, so good? Next, we want to see this a little bit sharper, so this is one step I forgot in the material. Let's open up the material again, go to the editor, and change the texture preview size from default to no scaling. But this doesn't fix that the texture is applied incorrectly. So we select the material tag of the volume measure, and we change the projection from UVW mapping to cubic. And now this should be applied a lot more evenly and fitting to our object. I do want this to be a little bit larger. If I compare it to how dense the texture here is on the floor, I think this is a little bit too small. So, with the texture tag selected, we enable the texture mode, and we enable the scale tool. And with the scale tool, don't click on an axis, just click on an empty area and click and drag to the right, and this should scale up the texture overall.
Sorry, Larry, go back.
Sorry, what? So, now that we have done this, we can go back to our camera view and we can render this. And we will see that it looks kind of fine, just a little bit too dark, right? So, to give the sky a bit more intensity, we will go to the material of the sky. We will go into the illumination. We go to the generate GI setting. We increase the strength to 150 and we decrease the saturation to just 50. So the material of the sky, illumination, and there you will find those options. 150 and 50. Mm-hmm. And when we then render, it should be a little bit nicer when it comes to the integration. Huh? 50 for the saturation. The strength should be 150 and the saturation 50. Alrighty. Lastly, I want to add a little bit of hair. So when we take a look at the rendered result, I might have overdone it a little bit in here, but I did add a bit of hair because I know that there are some hairs. I should have made them maybe a little bit thinner so it is a bit more integrated. But here I can see that the texture is just super, super soft, and this can only happen because of some hairs on it. So I wanted to add some hairs on my object as well. I will do the steps first, afterwards we do them together, and then we do the break. I have the volume measure selected because it obviously needs to be applied to the volume measure. Now I do know that hair usually prefers to be on a polygon object, and I know that the volume measure sometimes takes a while to recalculate, so I want to get rid of this. How do I get rid of the volume measure so that it's just a polygon object, but I keep everything else as a backup? We've done this, I think, last class. I know it's been 2 weeks, but I need a polygon object of this. I don't want to use the make editable option, because that way it deletes this object and replaces it with the polygon version of it. Let me give you a hint. I already said that that is not the one that we wanted. Current state to object, thank you. So when I do this, it does essentially what the make editable option does, but a little bit more because it creates a copy of this, which also has everything applied like the displacer. So I do this, it needs to think for a moment, but when it's done, I can disable the volume measure, the displacer, the volume builder, the text, and my volume measure as a polygon version is exactly the same thing that I had before, but now as polygons. So when I work with hair or other things, Cinema will be a lot more responsive. So I select my volume measure, then I go to simulate, then to hair objects, and I add hair. Now this looks a little bit crazy. Everything is fine. Sure. Cool. So, the thing is that hair is by default generated based on the points that we have. The volume measure gives us a lot of points, so we get a lot of hairs. I don't want this. So what I would do is, I will switch my root first from polygon vertex to polygon area, and then I decrease the count to something like 5,000. This should be a lot easier to manage. And now I can see how these are way less hairs, but I think this is a good amount. keeping note that these are just guides. These are not the actual hairs. There are too many people typing and not looking here. That's why you don't remember things. So, I have my guides, and I have 5,000 of them. They are a little bit too long, so let me change them to something like 3 centimeters. This already looks like a good length for the hairs. Now you might remember that the amount of guides does not represent the amount of hairs. So I could have 5,000 guides, I could have 5 million guides, but this does not change the amount of hairs that I will have. To change the amount of hairs, I have to go to the hairs, and here you can see, coincidentally, it is also set to 5,000. This is just the default amount of hair. But I know that if I get 5,000 hairs, I would have this many hairs, and this is not enough. I need way more. So I will go and add another 0, so now I have 50,000 hairs. If I render it, it will look like this. Okay. So, kind of getting there. We have some hair, I think the amount is fine. It's just way too thick. So, where do I change this?
Is there
Color.
also any bars
Sorry?
that we can add more roots, right?
No, I like the amount of hairs. I just don't like how thick they are. I want them to be thinner. Where do I change it? Do I change it on the hair object here? No! Do I change it on the hair material? Yay! So I open this up, then I will go to the thickness option here. And there I can see that the root is 1 centimeter and the tip is 0.1 centimeter. So this is obviously way too thick. I will change the root to 0.1 and the tip to 0.02. Now, when I render, I can see that they will be a lot thinner and matching a little bit more to the thickness that I would expect it to have with a texture like this. Alright, but they don't have the correct color. They are brown. So,
color pick from material.
There's something that works even better. When I go to my color, we've done this when I showed you how to make a cow pattern. The hairs can pick the color from the surface that they're on. So I enable the surface. And I tell it to use the color, illumination, and shadow. When I now render this, this color will be overwritten and it will take the exact same color that sits directly underneath the hair. So now all the hairs will have the same color as what we see underneath it. This will now make our texture feel a little bit more random because it breaks up shadows because of the hairs that are on top of it. And we have some nice fuzzy edges here. I do think, however, that these hairs are way too even. So I will add some frizz and kink. I will also go to the length and I will add some more variation to it, like 80%. So when I now render, these hairs will be with different lengths and they will be randomly displaced, sort of. So when we take a look at them here, we will see how they look a lot more natural and not these perfectly straight things. Alrighty. So this, I think, is a very good starting point for the hairs. So I could go back to my camera and I could do a rendering and take a close look at what I get in here. Always keep in mind that rendering with hair does take additional time. So it will take time to prepare, and also the rendering itself will take a little bit longer because there's just so much more geometry that needs to be calculated. But when we take a super, super close look, we can see how this texture just breaks open on these edges. And it doesn't feel like a perfectly smooth edge on the text, but just this tiny bit of details on these edges. So we feel fuzziness. Let's add the hair together. We start by right-clicking on the volume measure and converting the current state to object. This might take a second or two. And we should then have a polygon version of the volume measure at the bottom. So far, so good? Then we don't need the original volume measure and everything inside it anymore. So we turn all the checkboxes off. So no text is generated, nothing of these things do anything, they don't exist anymore essentially. But we have a merged version of this here. It would make it faster actually.
But if they are insignificant now, they
Mhm.
cross them out. But if you prefer to just delete that, or would that?
No, that doesn't do anything. However, when we delete them, we couldn't go backwards. So this way, we have the option to say, let's delete the volume measure, turn these things on, change the displacement, change the text, and then just convert it again. If you delete it, then you're stuck with what you have. So these things, when they're turned off, they don't take up space, they don't take up power, they just don't exist, but you still have them as a backup. So with the volume measure selected, the polygon version of it, we will go to Simulate, Hair Objects, and we choose Hair. Then we should get this afro-like thing. So far, so good?
We have to put the link first,
The what? So, first, we want to have less guides. I would recommend also changing the root first. This will make it a little bit more reliable when we change the amount. So we go to the root and we change it from polygon vertex to polygon area. Then we change the count to 5,000. Then we change the length to 3. So now it should look something like this. So far, so good?
Yes.
We do want, however, more hairs than we see guides right now. So we go to the hairs. And we change the count to 50,000. Then we want to make them overall a little bit thinner, so we already know what we need to change in the material. So we open up the hair material. We go to the thickness, and we change the root to 0.1 and the tip to 0.02. Thickness. Then we want to fix the color. So we go to the color channel. Then we go to the surface options and we enable it. It does not show anything in the preview because the preview doesn't know what the object is that it's applied to. Then we want the hairs to have different lengths. So we enable the length option. And we change the variation from 20 to 80. We also want to enable frizz and kink. And when we then render, we should get some nice random hair on our object. Now there's one last thing that I want to change in order for this project to be finished, I give you a hint. What does everything have? Everything has
Texture. Hard.
Boyfriend.
that is getting where I want to. Everything has Fresnel.
Okay.
So where do we add the Fresnel? What was it for? You said it? Reflection. We open up the material for our text here. Then we go to the reflectance. The reflectance still has the default specula, which always looks crappy. So we want to get rid of it. So the default specula should be deleted. Instead, we then add ggx. We then scroll down and we open up the layer Fresnel option. Here we can choose the Fresnel, and would this be a dielectric or a conductor?
Dielectric.
It would be a dielectric. I think the preset can stay where it is, should be just fine, but I can see that the reflections here are way too strong, so I want it to be a lot more blurry. So what do I change to make it smoother? The roughness. So as I increase the roughness, it gives me a nice, soft reflection. So something like this, 30, maybe 40% roughness should be fine.
Shouldn't that be smoothness? Because
Huh?
technically that's smoothness, right? Like the more you're increasing it, the smoother it's becoming, right?
No. If something is perfectly smooth, we will get a perfectly mirrored reflection. If a surface is kind of like sandpaper, it's rougher, the rougher it is, the more that reflection is broken up. Like water. When water is smooth, we can see it, but when there are lots of tiny waves, the reflection gets a lot more distorted and blurred. So roughness is actually the correct use for the word. All right, when we then render, we're done.
I have an issue though.
How do you have an issue?
Because it created two objects, as you said, and then deleted the material also. On the polygon.
Ah, just copy the material down.
I did, it just looks weird.
Did you apply it new, or did you copy the one that you already had? If you apply a new material, then of course you need to adjust the things that we changed in the tag. But if you copy the tag, then it takes on all the other properties that we had before as well.
Can I just say Control C?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, no. Control dragging to copy it down. Or command, both work. And then it should be fine. Alrighty. Then I would say, let's take a short break of 10 minutes. Okay, let's say 13. So we see it again at 3:30.
Break?
So, for this example, we will do something that is a little bit more complex than you might want to do. But I will show it to you anyways because it is a very useful thing. In the first example that we built, we didn't have information of what the scene looks like. We just have something. We are not quite sure how the floor is, so when we place an object on there, it doesn't matter if it matches exactly because we don't know, the user doesn't know, so who cares? If it looks good, then it looks good. In this example, however, we have very clear lines that indicate how the perspective should work. So for us to just guess what the actual camera is a lot harder. Unfortunately, or this is unfortunate. Fortunately, we do have an option in Cinema that can help us generate the correct camera position and the correct camera, what is the word? Angle of view. I will do the first steps first. You should really pay attention here, because it is something that is very, very new to us. So all new things. So look, so you don't get lost later on. I start by actually creating a camera. Then I right-click on the camera, I go to Cinema 4D tags, and I will add a tag that is called Camera Calibrator. While the camera calibrator is selected, I will see a special interface for it. If I don't have it selected, I will not see it anymore. So keep that in mind. I will repeat this in a bit again. So I select the calibrator tag, I go to the image tab, and I will add an image to this. I click on the dot dot dot, and I will choose the image from the second folder, which I want to use as my background. It will then be loaded into my viewer. This is always depending on the current camera. When I say watch, you don't type stuff on your computer. Here, this is always based on the camera. I can't move around like this. If I move around like this, you can see something weird is happening. I can see the camera in the background. So as long as the tag is selected, this thing will override my view. If I deselect it, I'm outside of it and I can see what's happening here. If I select it, it overlays the rest. If I want to see details of this, I have to navigate with these options, the image scale and the image offset. So I could zoom into the image if I want to, and I can move around the image like this. I can always reset this by clicking on full image or width or height. So essentially these two options, or automatically the full image, depending on what the ratio of the image is. I will keep to the match width. I think this should be fine for us. I will then go to calibrate. What we do here is we give Cinema 4D information of how certain axes are in this image. Based on these axes, Cinema can then calculate what is the camera and where is the camera in 3D space.
So when you say match width, is it cropping out some bits?
Yes.
Or is it stretching?
It's cropping. You can also see here, it's actually changing the scale. If I say match height, it will scale down to 75%. And match width is the default, because by default it should always fill the screen. We don't want any transparent areas on the edges. Then I will go to calibrate, and I can create three things. I can create lines, grids, and a pin. A line is just a line. So I click on add line and it creates a line over here. I could, for instance, use this line to define where my z-axis is. So the z-axis usually goes away from the camera. So I would create a point here, and I know that these ones should probably be aligned. This looks fine too. Now to tell Cinema which axis this is, I have to hold down the Shift key and click on it. With every time I click on this, it changes the color, and therefore we define which axis this belongs to. Just having one line is not enough. It needs at least two, preferably three lines in order to know how the field of view is based on the perspective. So here I might want to go to my image, move upwards a little bit so I can see the entire top part here. It's best if we choose other lines that are as far away as possible. The further away lines are from one another, the more accurate the end result will be. So I go back to calibrate, I add another line, and I create it parallel to the one that I created before. I don't move it all the way back here because I'm not quite sure where that would be. So instead, I place it up here where I know that it should be correct. I shift click it until, oops, sorry, wrong shortcut, until this turns blue. So now Cinema knows, okay, so here it goes into a certain direction and here it goes into a certain direction, and it knows that the lines meet there. Based on this, it already calculated what the Z vanishing point is. We can always check here what it knows and how well the information is that it gets. Red means it doesn't know what this is. Yellow means it has something, but it's not quite sure how accurate it is. Green means this is good, I can work with this, definitely. Yellow, in most cases, however, is already fine. The other option is to use a grid. With a grid, we define the four corners. For instance, one corner down here, another corner down here, a corner up here, and a corner up there. The nice thing about a grid is I only have 4 points, but I've already created 4 lines. I hover over one of the lines on the sides. I click it, it turns red, but having a x-axis going upwards is quite unusual. So I click on it again, so it turns green. So this is now defined as my y-axis. And here, I click on it once while holding down Shift, and it now knows that this is the x-axis. And now, I can see all of them are solved because we have more axes, it knows what the focal length is and the orientation of the camera. Then I could also add an additional one, for instance, for the y-axis, because I know a clear line that this is probably parallel to this one. So I will add another line, and I will add this back here. Like so. Shift click on it, define it as green, and now we can see it gives me an error value. The lower this value is, the better the placement is. This, however, can change drastically if you just move something by a single pixel to the side. So depending on how accurately you place your lines, this value might differ. If this value is small enough, this one will turn green. But as I said, this is depending on how accurately I place these corners, and if they are yellow, this is still good enough for most cases. Now the last thing that's missing is the position, and this is what the pin is for. So I create a pin, which is this super tiny circle that we see here. I can click and drag it, and I can snap it to the corner of the z-axis here. The pin defines where the origin of the world is. Now, I could go into the camera, and this camera will look at the world in exactly the same way that the picture was taken. So why would this be necessary or useful? A, whenever I create some text, I know that the camera is correct, so the distortion of the text is correct. I know that it will sit directly on the floor, even if I place things around in 3D space. So let me show you how we could use this. I could create a plane, and I could make this large enough. Then I can go to the calibration tag, scroll down, and I can say that I want to create a background object. I also want to create a camera mapping tag. There's one issue with the material that it gives us here. We don't want to use it. Instead, I want to always use the material that we get from the background object. The material tag, however, here is already set up to be a camera projection with all the correct settings. So I want to replace the material, but not the tag. To do that, I take the darker material and I drop it onto the material tag to just replace the material, but not the rest of the settings. I can now apply this one to the plane. If I go outside of the camera, I can see how this is now projecting onto my floor. If I now also see my background, which I do, if I go to my camera here, I can now, for instance, create an object and I can move it around, and will always move around perfectly in the correct perspective of the surrounding. Additionally, I can use this now to rebuild my geometry and recreate the scene that I have. And this goes quite easily in here. I could move this by 100 centimeters back to the left and 100 centimeters backwards. Then I can make it editable. I can then go outside and I can apply the same material to the cube. If I now change my cube, so I make it higher and wider and deeper, it will project, it will project the image directly onto this. So if I go, for instance, to my constant shading, and I go into the camera, everything aligns perfectly. And when I'm like this, I've now recreated parts of the picture in 3D space. The nice thing about this is that now this could also receive a shadow. So if I have an object that lies against the wall, it could cast a shadow on the wall. Or if I have another cube here, for instance, you can see how it will intersect with this. So it will intersect with the object here, can even go behind the object. Ooh. So let's get to this point here together. We start by creating a camera. Then we right-click on the camera and we go to Cinema 4D tags. Then we go to the camera calibrator, a little bit more in the top of the list. With the tag selected, we will switch to the Image tab. And next to Image, we click on ... to add the image. And we will use this image here, which is in the second folder that you've gotten today. When we click Open, it should show up in here. Now we already know that we want to focus a little bit more on the upper part, so we see these lines as long as possible. The longer the lines, the more accurate it will be. So let's take the image offset and just offset the image so we can see more of the top area, because we are not creating lines down here anyways. Image offset Y. Yeah, negative 10% should work fine. Then we will switch to the Calibrate tab. And we want to add a line. So we click on Add Line. We should now see how there's this very thin gray line here. Hover over the corners, click and drag, and you can define where a line begins and where a line ends. After you've placed the line, you need to tell Cinema to which axis it belongs. So you hold down the Shift key and you click on the line, and you should see how it turns red. The more often you click on it, the more it will change the color. So we want to click it until it turns blue. So blue is the z-axis, and the z-axis always points away from the camera. So far so good? Then we add a second line. This line we want to place as far away as possible from the first one, but it needs to be perfectly parallel to it. So probably up here. After you placed it, again, hold down Shift and click on the line until it turns blue. All right. Next, we want to create a grid on the left side here. We click on Add Grid, and we place our corners at the bottom of the first white line that we see. Don't place it directly onto the floor, because the floor is not even. As you can see, this brick is shorter than this one. So apparently the floor is a little bit crooked. So we rather want to use the lines up here. They're more likely to be more accurate. And then we place the other corners up here.
Doesn't matter which size we make. Doesn't matter what size we make.
What do you mean by size?
As in, like I took the line.
Yeah. However, it's always better to have them as far away as possible. It will be more accurate that way. Then we hover over one of the edges, hold down Shift. The vertical lines should be green to represent the y-axis, and the horizontal lines should be red, representing the x-axis. We should now see that we have a lot of yellow, a bit of green, and only one that is red. So far, so good?
Yeah.
All right. Now, because we have one more line that is nicely far away from our y-axis, let's just add it and see if we can get one of the points to become green. So let's add an additional line, and we place it on the edge of the back pillar. So we place it like this, and we define this one as green. If we did it well, we might get a green one, but apparently still not good enough to be green. But maybe one of you guys did it better. Nailed it. I didn't.
So it's exactly the line.
It's the green.
Okay. So far, so good? C. Alrighty. Next, we want to tell it where the origin is of the world. So we click on Add Pin, and it will create a pin in the center of our camera, this orange circle. Click on the center of the orange circle and drag it down, and you will see that it snaps to the edge of the z-axis. And then you can release the mouse. So far, so good? Alrighty.
Doesn't matter. I placed the grid actually always on the side of the line.
Alrighty. Next, we want to create a camera mapping tag and a background. Unfortunately, the material that is used for the camera mapping is a material that is set to luminance. So the brighter material is a luminance material, and we really don't want this. We don't need this at all. A background only needs color, it doesn't need luminance. And this one here needs to receive shadows and such, and that only works with a color material.
So what?
How can you tell that it's luminous?
It looks brighter, and when I open it up, I can see that it's applied in the luminance channel instead of the color channel. So we should have two materials at the bottom here. We take the material that is darker and we drag it onto the brighter material tag up here. Not next to it, not onto the camera, onto the tag to replace it. So that way we should have two dark material tags up here. It's on the material, on the camera tag here. At the bottom, these two buttons. They create them. Now we don't need the luminance material anymore, so we can select it and delete it. So we should only have one material down here, which is applied to both objects.
So what would have happened if we just deleted the luminance stuff?
Next, we want to create something where we can project our material on. Let's start with a plane. So we create a plane and we just scale it up to be a little bit larger. We can always change the size later on if necessary. Then we apply the material from the camera. It's important that it's the material from the camera and not the material from the background. So from the camera, we drag it onto the plane. While we are not inside of the camera, we should see how it projects this onto our plane.
Did you rotate it? Did you rotate the plane?
No, why would I? I made it larger. One thing that I didn't do earlier, but something that we should do, you might accidentally go into the camera and move the camera around. As soon as you move the camera around, but the scene doesn't move, the projection will not fit anymore on the objects that we have. So when we start rebuilding our scene, it's crucial that the camera does not move anymore, so we want to lock it. Just like we did before with the protection tag. Let's do this together. Right-click on the camera, go to Cinema 4D tags, and we choose the protection. You cannot do this before now, because
is there a way to lock the camera view when you didn't turn it on before? What? You know?
huh?
Like I didn't turn it on, but I did everything with it being off. You know?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just mean the protection can now be added because the camera is placed. Listen. The camera is moved by the calibrator. As soon as we start adding lines, the camera will change its placement and rotation and information. If we add the tag before, then this tag could not do stuff because the camera is protected. So only when we are finished with this, then we can add the protection tag, not beforehand. That's all that I wanted to say. Now that we have the protection tag on it, we can safely go into the camera at any point in time or go outside of it, and we could never forget it because the camera is locked. If we go inside of it and we try to move, we can't. Alrighty, next we want to rebuild this part here on the side. We take a cube together. We take a cube and we move this one 100 centimeters backwards and 100 centimeters to the left. So the corner of the cube should sit precisely in the corner of where the pillar is. So far, so good? Yeah? Next, we want to convert this into a polygon, so we hit C. Then we want the same material to be on the cube as well. So we take the material tag that we have on the plane, we control click and drag this onto the cube. You can also use command click and drag, both work. So this way we are copying the texture tag from one object to the other. So now we should see that our bricks are applied to the cube, something like this. Yeah?
It looks weird.
All right. Now that we've converted it into polygon, it's very easy to adjust this. So we switch to the polygon mode on the left side here. Then we choose the move tool and we click on the top polygon, and we can then drag this upwards until we reach the end of the image. Then we can select the polygon here on the left side on the back, and we drag this to the side until we reach the end of the pillar, like this. And then we do it on the actual back side here as well, until we reach the end of the pillar. It will look a little bit weird from behind, but when we look at it like this, it should look actually quite good.
We select only one side, right?
Hmm?
Do we select only one side?
Always only one side at a time.
Yeah, and then.
No!
Jesus.
That is the side and not the top. The top is moved up, but the sides are moved to this side. So, now that we have our basic surrounding here, we can start adding actual things to this. I will do the next things first. Afterwards, we will do them together. Sorry. Two. I will go into the camera and I will create some text. I will go, just me doing it, I will go to MoGraph and I will go to MoText. Then you can see I can place this around and I know that this is always matching to the perspective quite nicely. Now for the light. I've done something special here. I have used my phone to create a spherical panorama of the scene when I was taking the photo. So I took this picture, then I stood, not exactly here, I was going a little bit further back, and I've taken a spherical panorama. Most phones these days do give you the option by default. If your phone app doesn't do this, you can always download a free app for it. Usually they work in a certain way. Let me quickly show you how it looks on mine. So for the recording it's not that helpful, but or on my phone it's called Phone Sphere, but there I can start somewhere. I take a picture, and then I move it around. And then I take the next picture, and the next picture, and the next picture, and so on. And I do that for all of these surrounding until I have the entire scene mapped out. The important part when doing that is that you try to move the camera as little as possible, because this only works well if the camera stays in the precise same position and you only move the phone like this around the camera. I didn't do that. So my end result looks a little bit wrong, but for the purpose that I needed it for, it was fine. So let me go back to the folder and take a look at the image. You can see that in areas that are far away from me, it works quite well. So here, everything is stitched pretty nicely together, only small issues here and there, but they should be fine. I do, however, have larger issues with elements that were very close to me. So here you can see they are not aligning at all. This is not an issue of the camera, this is an issue of how I've taken the picture, because I was moving around and therefore the perspective of this and the background has changed. The foreground and the background were not exactly the same on all the pictures that I've taken because I moved around in 3D space. So they are, for real cameras, special rigs where the nodal point is not at the bottom of the camera, but instead the camera is pushed backwards, so the nodal point is where the lens is. And that way you are not changing the position of the camera, you really only rotate it around the center. Now, for the purpose here, this is totally fine. I just wanted to get the general scene here. I don't care about these tiny details. The nice thing is now that I can use this to light up my scene, plus I can use this for reflections. Let me show you what this does. Me doing first, because we will do it slightly differently later on. Yeah?
And for lighting up scene, you need a panorama, or is it just that you used one? Because like this image also has light in it, right?
This image also has light in it, but you will see in a moment. Here, I will create a material and I will put it onto my sky and I will use the panorama that I've taken. I can then create a sky, apply this to a sky, and I could now, for instance, take a sphere that I place in here, and I could apply a material that is very reflective. Maybe I turn off the color and I give this just the background reflection. I put it on the sphere, and already I can see that now the sphere is actually reflecting that panorama. And this is a realistic reflection of that scene. Also, it will reflect this side here once I render. So when I render this now, I can see that it reflects the panorama, it reflects the wall, it reflects the floor, and it casts a shadow on the wall here. And the light is almost okay. The one issue that I have is it does not give me a hard shadow on the side. So here we can see we get a hard shadow, but my text doesn't cast that hard shadow, neither does my sphere. The reason is that this is just taken with my phone. This is not an HDR image. There's no information that is brighter than 1, and 1 is not that bright. 1 is like a light bulb, if at all. But a sun is much, 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 much brighter than a light bulb. So what I've done is, I've taken that image, and in Photoshop I converted it into 32 bits, and I created a sun myself, just a small circle. I used it as a mask on an exposure layer, and I increased the exposure by 15 points. Then I was getting a sharp shadow. Unfortunately, there's a tiny bug in this version of Cinema 4D, where then the floor is not seamless anymore with the background if there's information in the HDRI that is too bright. So unfortunately, I could only create an image that is almost as good. So we still need to create the sunlight ourselves. But I created an HDR image that resembles the light scenario a little bit better. I've increased the contrast a bit, where the area of the sun is a lot brighter than the areas around it. It also matches the contrast of the picture a little bit better, because this one is pretty flat, so it did not look that realistic, because here we have some very high contrasts. On the sky, as always, I would go to the compositing tag and tell this one to not be seen by the camera, and on the floor, I would tell this one to be compositing and a compositing background. The same tag I will also apply to the cube, because it's also a compositing background. When I now render this, I will already have a little bit of a more realistic reflection here concerning the colors. Also, the light is a little bit better than it was before, but still I don't get a shadow as sharp as I want it to be. So here I can already see the shadow is cast to the left side, so apparently I need to rotate the panorama. I can already see this in here, because I can see that the sun right now comes from the left. So apparently it shines towards the x-axis. So we'll take the sky and I rotate it around until the x-axis points into the direction of the shadow. So now I know that the shadow here that the HDRI is creating is aligned the way it should, and also the reflection that we get here, we can now see that this weird story building on the side is now also on the correct side. The last thing then is just creating a light. Because I'm imitating the sun, I will use an infinite light. I will enable the shadows, and I rotate it around something like this. I will go to my options, I will enable shadows, and I will try to align the shadow of the pillar to the shadow on the wall here. When I now render, I will get realistic shadows for the scene. Alrighty, let's do this together. We start by, let me get rid of this, creating some text. So we go to MoGraph, text, and I'll just keep it at the default. You can feel free to play around with the different content. always make sure that you only move it on one axis at a time. If you move it upwards, if I go outside of the camera, I can see that this is now flying in the air. So when you move it, always make sure that you keep it on the floor and you only move it on the x-axis and the z-axis, but not the y-axis, unless you want it to be floating. So that will be fine too. But don't do it accidentally. Then, just so that we have it as a reference, let's create a sphere. And we know that we will need a sky. For the sphere, we will create a material that is like a mirror. So we double click to create a new material. We open it up. We go to the reflectance. We get rid of the default specular and we add GGX. You also want to turn off color, although it doesn't really make much of a difference here. This mirror material we will apply to the sphere.
Where do GGX you add, right?
GGX instead of the default specular. Looks good. And then you apply this one to the sphere. Then we need a material for the sky. So we double click to create a new material. For a sky material, we don't want to use color, only luminance. Turn the reflections off as well. It's just unnecessary. Then in the luminance, we will click on the dot dot dot, and we will use the surrounding.hdr. And we click on open. This HDR we will then apply to the sky, and we should see how it shows up in the reflection of the sphere. So far, so good?
Yes.
Now we know that the sunlight here is on the left side. This thing here is just the default specular from the default light, so we can ignore it. But the sun is over here, which means we need to rotate it around clockwise by roughly 90 degrees so that the sun comes from the correct direction. So with the sky selected, we go to the rotate tool, and this red line here needs to align with the shadow, and then the sun should be aligned correctly. So we rotate it around until the red line is aligned with the shadow. Then in the HDR, we should not see any sunlight because it comes from the back. So far, so good? Yeah, looks all right.
What's the black part? What is this?
This is another bug in cinema where it has issues, as I said, when things are getting too bright. And the sun here right now is 12 exposures brighter than 1. And apparently the editor here already has issues
This is
showing
because
that.
you did it on Photoshop and then.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. All right. The sky should not be visible by the camera. Instead, we wanted to show the background. So we right-click on the sky, go to Cinema 4D tags, and we choose the compositing background, the compositing tag, and we disable the scene by camera option. Then the cube and the plane should both be compositing backgrounds. So we right-click on the cube, Cinema 4D tags, compositing, and we enable the compositing background. And we can then just copy the tag from the cube down to the plane by holding down the Command or the Control key as we drag the compositing tank down. Alrighty. Then, when we render, it should look like this. So far, so good? Alrighty. So, lastly, we just want to imitate how the light works. We create an infinite light. On the infinite light, we enable the shadow, and we want it to be an area shadow. We know that it points always towards the z direction. So this blue line here that we see should now be aligned roughly with the shadow that we have. So we just move it around until the blue line is kind of aligned with the shadow. But we might need to move it a little bit further away than that. If you want to see the shadows in here, you want to go to the options and enable shadows. And then you should be able to match the shadow of the pillar kind of with the shadow on the bottom. So something like this. You can always hit render and double check if in the rendered image these shadows seem to match up. There's one last thing that I want to do with this, and that is getting rid of this white line. You might have seen it. But when I render this in the reflection here, I do see that there's a little bit of a white line here and a white line at the top of the pillar. The issue here is that what we see there is the end of the floor where we don't have our image applied anymore, and that is just the default grayish color. This can be fixed with a little trick. I will just show you how it works. I just turn off everything in the material. I only turn on alpha. As the alpha, I add a color, and the color should be black. So essentially, I create a material that doesn't exist. I then apply this material both to the plane and to the cube first. So first, I tell the plane to be nothing, and then this is added on top. And now we can see how there's actually nothing. So this is how it looked like before, and this is how it looks like now. So when we have these issues, where we have these overlaps and we see the default color, just create a material that essentially doesn't exist, apply it first, so that the camera projection is only added on top of the transparent one. When we render this, there's one thing that you need to keep in mind, that an issue that we would also have with the previous project. Let me just render this really quickly in a very small format, like fourth of this. And let me save this to the desktop just real quick. Test. When I render this out, I will get some weird issues. It renders, so for now everything seems fine. But as soon as it's done, something weird is going to happen. This. I see weird lines here and there. Do you know why? Now it's yours. Time to
We
shine.
have put a date before them.
Sorry, what was she saying? I don't remember the. Yeah, sorry. I can't show me.
Isn't it the end of the plane?
Huh?
Isn't it the end of the plane?
Exactly. So what's happening here? We've had this last quarter 2 or 3 times.
Is it because of the infinity light?
All wrong. All wrong. The thing is that both a sky and a background are not considered geometry by Cinema 4D. So when we render and we tell Cinema to render out an image with alpha, it will turn these things off. Because we are saving something as a PNG, alphas will always look a little bit weird when the alpha is turned off. And the picture viewer cannot show alpha channels. So we see the naked PNG, which looks like that. If I look at the rendered file, I notice that I actually rendered this out with a transparent background here. So here it looks kind of clean, but in our editor we can already see due to these edges that it apparently rendered something with a straight alpha and saved it this way. But of course we don't want this. So when you render out something like this, where you don't want the alpha to be changed, to be there, always remember to turn off the alpha channel. Because when I now render this, and I overwrite the file that I already have, it will render it and I won't have any issues. So after it saved it, it will be saved. I don't have any glows, I don't have any alpha, all is good. Okay? Good. Then, this is it. For your homework, I want you to create an example like this as well. Take a picture of something, create some text or another object, and integrate it with the picture. What I then want to get is both a rendering as well as the Cinema 4D file, because I want to double check that you remember to do all the correct steps with all the compositing tags and stuff like this. When you send me the Cinema 4D file, it's important that I need to get the assets as well. Because the assets can be anywhere on your computer, when you save your file, go to File, and then use the option called Save Project with Assets. And this is kind of like creating a project from InDesign, where it just creates a folder, it puts the Cinema 4D file, and it copies all the used images into that folder. That folder, you zip it, send it over via WeTransfer, preferred if it's too large. You can use either the first technique that we use, where we just create our camera ourselves, create all the text ourselves, or if you can also use the camera calibrator. Just keep in mind that whenever we use it, all the lines that we see need to be perpendicular. This means the y-axis and the x-axis need to have 90-degree angle between them. And the x-axis and the z-axis also need to have an exact 90-degree angle to them. So here, I was pretty sure that that is the case. But if I, for instance, take this room, I could take lines from the wall, but I might not use lines from the table as well, because I'm not sure if the table is perfectly aligned with the floor and the walls. If I know it is, then I can of course use these lines. But if I'm unsure, you shouldn't, because then Cinema gets information that just doesn't match. So whenever we define the x, y, and z axis, we need to make sure that they are perfect with 90-degree angles from one another. Otherwise, you don't use them. Make sense?
Yes.
Awesome. Then, have a nice weekend and see you next week.
You too. Thank you.